Hi folks, Joseph Kursky here with you again, as usual, to discuss my favorite books that I read throughout the year. This is for 2022. I read 64 books in 2022, and I'm going to highlight some of my favorites, geographically speaking, historically speaking, novels, and much more. First of all, I encourage you to read. It's a great conversation starter for a social setting. Hey, what have you been reading lately? And it also expands your mind in many ways that we could talk about. In January, I read 6 books. The Atlas of Extinct Countries was one of my favorites, but I think Madhouse at the End of the World about the Belgians voyaging down to Antarctica was my favorite in January. In February, I read 6 books, including a biography of Janis Joplin, which was a bit sad, but interesting. But I think my favorite one was probably The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. I also read The Cartographer's Secret, which was near and dear to my heart. In March, I read 4 books. I finally read Anne of Green Gables. I'd never read that before, but I think my favorite was The Man Who Walked Backwards, very geographical, back in the 1930s. April, I read 8 books. Love in the Time of Bertie by Alexander McCall Smith was my favorite book in April. In May, I read 4 books, including Stat Spotting, which I reviewed on our Spatial Reserves data blog. It's all about spotting dubious data and being critical of data. So that's near and dear to my heart. But I think my favorite one was by Pastor Ortland called Gentle and Lowly. That was in May. June, I read 7 books. L to Z, the McCartney lyric book, was probably my favorite book in June. And also, I read The Last Mapmaker. I loved them both. In July, I read 4 books. 1939 was an interesting book, but I think my favorite book was The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd. Fascinating book with lots of implications and lots of historical roots on how we represent things in cartography. In August, I read 6 books, including The Lincoln Highway by Towles, T-O-W-L-E-S. That was my favorite book in August, The Lincoln Highway. I read that while I was traveling on the Lincoln Highway in Nebraska and Iowa, so it had a special meaning. In September, I read 5 books. My favorite was The Road to Cana, The Road to Cana. In October, I read 3 books. My favorite was Lie of the Land, which is about representing the world with maps, near and dear to my heart. November, I read 3 books. I think my favorite book was The American Spirit by David McCullough. We lost him, sadly, in 2022. Historical writer, author, wonderful man. And this book was a collection of his speeches that he gave to commencements and dedications of places and so on. The American Spirit. I also read There Was Light by an author that wrote about Abraham Lincoln. That was a fascinating book, and that was my 2 favorites in November. December, I read 8 books, including A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, one of my all-time favorites. And I also read, I started it in October, finished it in December, a book about Hoover, which was quite long, but quite fascinating. Okay, so my favorite of the 64 books that I read in 2022 was The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. I mean, what's not to love? It is so good. I highly recommend you read that one, but also I hope these books have been enlightening, and I hope you dig into some of them, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you read in 2022. Thanks.